Always great to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for sparing the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
Sir Graham Brady there. OK, let's return now to our interview with the former head of immunisation at the Department of Health, Professor David Salisbury, who has called for the government to be more transparent about the scientific advice that it receives. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore has been speaking to the professor, who's also a member of the UK government's scientific advisory group. He started by asking the professor for his thoughts on the suggestion by Oxford University that they could have 1 million doses of a vaccine ready perhaps by September.
Well, 1 million doses by September is really exciting. But my question is, well, what happens after September? Because 1 million doses is just the starting point. The UK population, if we worked on the number of people who have flu vaccine, plus essential workers, police, fire, NHS workers, social care workers, let's just say we needed 20 million people to be vaccinated, and we needed to do that twice. That's 40 million doses. Well, how long does it take to make the first million? And if we had 1 million doses a week, that's 40 weeks just to get our vaccine. So expectations of huge quantities of vaccine have to be tempered with realism.
Is there a danger that some countries with certain political leadership will attempt to corral the vaccine for their own population, to stop it being exported and shared around the world?
Everybody will want to protect their own population, and there will be rationing. A lot will depend, of course, on the behaviour of the producers. Now, the producers may define how they handle requests from their customers, and they may come to a view that they will provide their vaccine equitably amongst not just those who can pay high prices, but those who can't afford high prices. So the world has to come to some conclusion about how, when this wonderful resource becomes available, we will share it.
In some parts of the world, people will see it as a matter of national security and will slap an export ban on a vaccine that is made within those borders.
I think that's a very real fear. And I have that fear also, that countries will say, we want to protect our own population first, and they will not allow export, even if the company producing it wanted to export it. So the behaviour of governments actually here may be more penetrant in the availability of vaccine than the behaviour of the producers.
We have our own SAGE committee in this country. How good a concept is it for channeling scientific advice to those who really need it at the top?
I think that it is a good way to bring together the best possible experts on a topic that you can find. I think that there's no reason actually to keep it secret. I do believe that in a world that we share now, transparency is more important than secrecy. And if people worry that they're going to be pestered, well, they don't have to answer the phone, and they don't have to accept every invitation to give an opinion. So I think the process is the right process to get the best advice. I think it should be the best scientific advice, and it's then up to the government to decide what to do with that scientific advice.
We are all, as a nation, being asked to make a sacrifice by staying at home based on the scientific evidence, we're repeatedly told. But it's very difficult to know what that genuine evidence is, what is being heard within that room.
No, I agree with you that we do have the right to know from whom the advice is coming. Why should we not know? The answer that we're protecting their privacy, I think, is no longer a realistic one. My name is in the telephone book. Why would we want to have such secrecy that you can't know who is helping shape these decisions that are affecting our lives?
It's impossible to ignore that on the 31st of January we were leaving the European Union. How much of a distraction do you think Brexit was to the government in those key early weeks?
All I ever read about in the newspapers was Brexit and preparing for Brexit. I do know that it was very difficult to get non-Brexit pieces of work taken through because of areas where I was involved. Since leaving the Department of Health, I've been very involved in polio eradication on a global scale. And it was difficult to get the UK's interest on just a very small piece of work because it was always being set aside for Brexit. If my one small experience has anything to go by, it was very difficult to get non-Brexit issues to be given priority.
Thomas Moore there, talking to Professor Salisbury. Well, now, Boris Johnson said today that he would be speaking to the opposition about tackling COVID-19, adding that it would be what the British public would want. Well, let's get the thoughts from the opposition then. Joining me now is the Shadow Minister for Business, Lucy Powell. Very good to talk to you, Lucy Powell. Well, I suppose there are two basic ways these cross-party discussions can work. The government comes along and tells you what they're going to do, or they actually ask you what they should do and you have some input. Presumably you want it to be the latter.
Well, look, we've been asking the government for a while to sort of publish its plans for the exit strategy, if you like, or how the phasing out of lockdown is going to transpire, how and when that might be, so that we can have an understanding of that. So I'm sure that Keir Starmer will very much welcome the opportunity to be part of understanding the science behind some of these difficult decisions that the government is going to have to make, and not just for opposition parties, but the public, business, trade union, workers, schools and other services. Everyone needs to be part of that conversation to understand what the science is saying about different scenarios, what the trade-offs are, and how things might get delivered.
That seems, in terms of what I posited to you, that seems to tend towards the former, understanding the science. So Boris Johnson comes along and tells Keir Starmer, this is what I've been told by the experts, this is what I'm going to do. Wouldn't you like Sir Keir to have some input and say, well, Prime Minister, perhaps try this instead?
Well, I think everyone needs to have an input, because what we heard today from the press conference from the Chief Science Officer was that there are a range of different scenarios. There isn't just one situation, one scenario. To keep that R number, that number of infection rates below 1, there are many different scenarios that could be deployed to do that. So there are choices there that the government will need to make. And I think the government, it's really important that the government take people with them along those choices, as Graham Brady was just saying to you earlier. So the opposition party need to be part of that. Trade unions need to be part of that. Businesses need to be part of that, as well as the wider public. So I think the Prime Minister did say this morning that he was going to start a bigger conversation, not just with the Labour Party, but with everybody else as well, so that we can all be part of that decision and that conversation, really. Well,
why don't you, as Her Majesty's opposition, why don't you start the conversation as well? If the Prime Minister decides that it's not the time to have that conversation, and that's what we've been hearing up to this point, why don't we hear it from you? Why don't you publish some of your suggestions or thoughts?
Well, we've been asking the government to start that conversation, and I'm glad to see that they have agreed with us now today when the Prime Minister's come back. I mean, look, we're not party to the same level, anything like the same level of evidence base, of scientific advice, governmental advice about, modelling of different things. We're the opposition. We haven't got the whole of the government machinery and all that comes with that at our disposal to weigh up those decisions. But hopefully, we'll get more sight of some of that, and so will everybody else, so that then we can all be part of that conversation and we can understand what decisions have been made, why and when, so that we will adhere to them, and so that we can all, especially sort of businesses and workers and schools and other places that are going to be so affected by this, so that people can have confidence and a bit more certainty about what's expected of them when.
But you seem to have said, Lucy Powell, I think as everyone understands, that there is no such thing as the science. There's no one answer coming from the scientists. And we hear that day after day, don't we, at those press briefings where they defer to the politicians there and saying, well, this is what we think from the data that's emerged so far, but you then have to make this political decision. Now, you, like the rest of us, listen to those news conferences and the discussions, and there's plenty of data out there. What does Labour think? For instance, let me put it to you directly. What about reopening the schools before the summer, or some of them?
Well, again, you can't just make a decision about one part without looking at the whole, because as was said today and as has been said before, there are a range of scenarios that might involve schools reopening, but involve less of the economy being able to reopen. There are all these different trade-offs within it. So I don't think you can look at one thing in isolation. And because we're not party to all that modelling and all that evidence, we would be irresponsible as an opposition for us to just call for one thing or call for another without being sure about that modelling and that science. But what we have been saying to the government is, look, you really do need to start publishing some of this modelling and science to take us and everybody else with you. But then also they need to do more to support those aspects that are going to stay closed for some time. So we've seen some welcome news today on business loans.
But just correct me if I don't understand you correctly, just on that. If the government publishes more of that science and the decision it takes, from what I understand from what you've been saying to me, Lucy Powell, is then you will agree, because you will say as Labour, we don't have access to that data. Therefore, what you've decided, we will accept.
Well, no, not necessarily, because if there are a range of different scenarios that are being put forward,
well, there are already.
Then we may take a view. No, we haven't seen the modelling behind them or the evidence. There are people calling for this or calling for that, or different pressure points within that system, and we haven't seen all of that. So we may well sort of take a slightly different view from the one that the government takes at the time that they take it. We don't know that at the moment. But what's important is there's transparency around that. That modelling and data and evidence and science is shared, not just with the Labour Party, but with the public, with businesses and everything else. And then what sits alongside that is making sure that the support is there for either those things that we're going to be telling to stay closed for even longer, like maybe the hospitality sector or certain business sectors that might have to shut their doors for even longer, or those that are going to be opened sooner. Let's say, for example, schools, if they're going to be in that first phase, there needs to be a lot of support in place to enable schools to know what's expected of them, to be able to open in a safe way that adheres to social distancing. That's quite a challenge for a school. And so that's why we need to have this conversation, because not only do people need that certainty, but we need to be sure that the government are putting in place the support that is necessary to either stay closed or reopen.
OK, Shadow Business Secretary, thank you very much indeed. Lucy Powell there.
Thank you.
And this is Sky News Tonight. Coming up, how football clubs are supporting NHS workers in their time of need.